reform era. And this was a really important period in terms of social welfare and highlights the origins of our profession, of the social work profession. So it's definitely one of my favorite time periods to talk about, and I'm happy to be able to do that today. So I call this presentation West Side Story 2, sort of a play on words. And the photo here is from one of the first settlement houses here in the Twin Cities area, the neighborhood house, which is on the west side of St. Paul, as you may know. And the neighborhood house has been serving immigrant communities since it was established in the late 19 or in the late 1800s. Um, and primarily first being started by a group of Jewish women and helping Jewish communities who were coming here from Russia who were being persecuted. So, a really rich and interesting history here locally that tells this very universal story of the settlement house movement across the United States. So I just love that photo. It's from, a later time period, but really highlights sort of this communal bond. And that was very much emphasized in the settlement house movement. So I will be talking about some different topics here today. First, an introduction about um, the time period that we're talking about here within the world, within the United States. So really focusing on the innovation and technology advances that were happening here, and where we left off from the post Civil War era. Also, some themes to understand social welfare's past and current day, right? So, these are the themes that we've been talking about since our policy class started here a couple months ago. So, these themes are really about the worthy versus the unworthy views of the poor, about how certain groups of people received assistance: veterans, children, women, people of color, indigenous communities, and what types of discrimination were prevalent during that time. Also, looking at the origins of social work, right? It's March. Happy Social Work Month, everybody. So, we'll be taking a look at the settlement house movement and taking a closer look at the neighborhood house, which we just talked about here, highlighting charity organization societies and Mary Richmond's, her very famous book entitled Social Diagnosis, which is kind of the social work Bible, so to speak, that really started this idea of looking at people in terms of their environment, right? And we know that that led to systems theory, which is the basis of our profession here as social workers. And then we'll talk about social movements in the early 20th century, coalitions, organized labor groups. During this time, it was really looking at starting to regulate businesses, looking at women's suffrage, and of course, Nativism really continued to manifest through this time in society and through government regulation. So by 1900, America was really this huge world power, right? We were leaving the Gilded Age. That's the time period when, as you may remember, our state capital was built. Would really encourage you to go on a tour of the state capitol and take in all of that history about that time period. It's just a really fascinating experience. So we talked a lot previously about how the West was really this frontier that needed to be discovered, quote unquote. And by this time, America, had really been surveyed. It had been sort of taken over by the colonists, and they were really looking at, um, what they could do to help innovation in terms of agriculture, in terms of manufacturing. And a huge innovation was the transcontinental railroad, right? So that really changed the way that agriculture, they were able to move perishable products very quickly. And so that was a huge innovation here that really changed the market, not only nationally but globally as well. Of course, around this time they're drilling the first oil wells, right? um, by 1900 they really started doing that, and petroleum became a huge export, um, as well as iron ore, steel, timber, cotton, sulfur. And the photo here demonstrating the assembly line here, for the um, for Henry Ford, for automating the first sort of car making process. And that was huge to be doing that. The telephone was, starting to happen. People were starting to have telephones in their homes. So just a lot of innovation. So the United States became the richest country on earth by the 1920s. By 1910, the richest 1.6% of the population received 19% of national income, right? So, folks that you've probably heard of, right? Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, the J.P. Morgans of the world, James J. Hill, right? A local railroad tycoon who, again, if you haven't seen his former residence on Summit Avenue, you walk into that dining room that is made out of gold, and that can really give you a sense of where a lot of the wealth was concentrated during this time. And then, of course, we had during this time period World War I, which also really helped in shaping social welfare policy. So we will just take a brief pause here so that we can watch this very short 5-minute movie just talking a little bit about the United States and their role in World War One.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had from the very beginning an official policy of neutrality, but neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the U.S., Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things, Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that the Allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
So, themes for understanding the past. Um, so, in the early 20th century, business was expanding. It was sort of this time of progressive reform in the United States. And these progressives, as they called themselves, they were motivated to make American society a better and safer place to live. And part of some of their efforts, they wanted to regulate businesses. They wanted to sort of take on corruption, improve working conditions and factories, better living conditions for people who are living in these tenement housing areas. And, a large number of whom were recent immigrants, right, from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this progressive movement was really concerned with these, the environment, these scarce resources. How are we going to help people? And so, that took shape in a lot of different ways, right? That we will talk about. Um, and then, of course, the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. This was the time of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who again is, if you haven't been on an F. Scott Fitzgerald tour in the Summit University neighborhood of St. Paul, it's really fascinating to see where he grew up, to see all of his old spots. The 1920s was really that roaring 20s period that has been so marked in literature and films, and pretty interesting local connection with F. Scott Fitzgerald. So a time of economic growth, prosperity, and the big industry was automobile manufacturing, and that really changed a lot of people's lives. So of course there are these themes that we continue to see, right, from starting in really the colonial era. We see a scarcity of resources, right? We see ethical considerations for assistance. If we have scarce resources, who is going to be receiving them? Who is worthy and who is not worthy, right? Um, we're looking at these movements, these community organizing efforts to enhance social justice. And of course, there is a conflict of values, right? As there usually is, ideas coming from different points of view on how to make sense of the world, right? So that American idealism of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, you can definitely see that during this time period. And this idea of nativism, really takes hold, which started earlier, before this we saw. Um, but definitely something important to talk about. So, this Naturalization Act of 1790, it permitted any free white person to become a US citizen after, I think it was 2 years of residency. Um, and they had the right to vote as soon as they arrived here. But by the 1950s, there was a lack of employment, and as we know, as we've studied, there was famine, unemployment, persecution, and so people were really, there were a lot of immigrants coming here, and by the 1850s, there were a lot of people who were sort of joining this nativist movement, right? They emerged as a political force in the form of this political party that they called the Know Nothing Party. And they truly believed that folks who were coming here, who were not native born, were going to take all the jobs. They were going to make society here worse. They were going to, just a lot of negative connotations in terms of what these immigrant communities would do to the United States. They also feared that immigrants would serve, their countries and loyalty to the countries that they were born in before they would serve the loyalty of the United States. Sorry, my daughter is right here, so I'm a little distracted. They were also worried about Catholics and their allegiance to the Pope because, after all, this was still a very Protestant nation, and a lot of people viewed Protestantism as sort of the main religion during this time and wanted to preserve that. And it was kind of interesting. This Know Nothing Party, they were called that because they directed their members to tell people when they were asked about the party, about their platforms, they directed people to say they didn't know. So that name sort of stuck with what their party was, um, which I think is pretty interesting. So when we look at, the goal here was to really limit power of men, right? Because women didn't have any power, was to limit the power of men who were not born into the United States, right? So if we look at some of these, think of some of the examples that we've already learned about, right? We have the Chinese Exclusion Act. That was, I think, in early 19 or 1880s, um, which essentially, suspended immigration and naturalization of Chinese citizens who were coming here, who were mainly laborers. Um, in early 90s, you had an immigration control law that was passed. You had in the early 1900s a Japanese ban, um, that was really aimed at trying to prevent entry of Japanese workers. And it just, a lot of things in terms of immigration law that really started to pass and started to happen during this time that was spurred by this idea of nativism. So that really took hold, so to speak, during this time period. So, also during this progressive era, we see veterans are receiving monetary benefits and rehabilitation services for the first time ever, right? So, that was really as a direct result of the Great War of World War One. We see children, the National Child Labor Committee form, and that's really, they're looking at child labor. And So they were doing that by taking photos of children working. They were trying to get legislation passed through the state and through Congress. Um, and, the Supreme Court deemed them, a lot of these laws, to be unconstitutional after they were passed. Um, but that didn't stop them from continuing to fight on that. Honey, can you just give me 1 minute, okay? Can you give me one more minute to go finish this? Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. So then, talking about women's rights, talking about women's suffrage, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, right? There was an increasing amount of women in the workforce. There's just a lot, going on in that time period. And we really see this emergence of women's rights kind of taking center stage. So child labor, women's rights, that was huge during this time. Union organizing was huge for these causes. Um, and it was interesting looking at the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They had this plan of sort of recruiting college educated, really sort of this privileged female population, um, families who had political connections. They did a lot of work on organizing, and they really wanted to do whatever they can to, you know, afford women the right to vote, afford women the right, rights in the workplace. And so, as we know, those efforts really spurred the 19th Amendment, and it was added to the Constitution, I think, in like 1920. So that was just a huge victory. We also see, like we were talking about before, this idea of nativism. We see the alien land law in California, which was specifically to prevent Japanese from buying land, right? They were laborers, they were incredible farmers, incredibly hardworking people, and they didn't want the Japanese to be landowners or be able to buy land. And so you saw a lot of legislation really directed at that. And then, of course, just this incredibly uh, this very dark period of American history, right? These indigenous communities. By this point, the wars between the Native American communities, the indigenous communities, those had come and gone. Um, and this was really the period where indigenous communities were going to boarding school, right? Indigenous youth were getting sort of this mainstream American culture through this education. And it was really an attempt for the United States to really destroy these people and their culture and just eradicate all of these indigenous cultures. And that really started, a lot earlier, as we've learned about. But this phase of the boarding school, um, was just it was just a systematic way for the government, and not only the government, right? I mean, it was Christian missionaries who were, managing a lot of these boarding schools. These were Christian missionaries doing a lot of this. So when we look back on our history, when we look back on this master narrative, we don't often learn in history books that these Christian missionaries had such a huge role, um, in something so incredibly horrible, to essentially annihilate these communities. And so this was a very difficult time, to say the least, for Indigenous communities. So this is a photo of the National Women's Suffrage Association, a couple of the supporters there. And I think it's important to also mention that Black women were not allowed to join these very popular suffrage movements, right? They had to do their own movements because they were not welcome. We often learn about Susan B. Anthony. We learn about a lot of these women who just did incredible advocacy. But, a story that usually isn't told is just the exclusionary nature and really the discrimination that a lot of these movements had. Um, and unfortunately, that is also part of the history that needs to be told as well. Um, so I wanted to talk about somebody, in terms of women's suffrage who really doesn't get any attention at all. We talk about Susan B. Anthony, we talk about all of these very famous women who were really this this you know very um, influential in this movement, but we don't talk about other women. Um, so this is Miss Burroughs, and she was just really an incredible civil rights leader and activist. Um, she chaired the National Association of Colored Women's Anti-Lynching Committee. She was the regional president for the National Association of Colored Women. She was, during the women's suffrage movement, just really instrumental um, in doing, a lot of incredible work. She was very active in the Republican Party. She helped found the National League of Republican Colored Women. I think that was in the early 1920s. Um, and Burroughs just really leaves this legacy of civil rights and um, really incredible advocacy that she did her entire life. So this is Ida B. Wells, and she was also a huge fighter for the women's suffrage movement, specifically for Black women. She founded her own suffrage club because, again, she wasn't allowed to participate in what was happening mainstream. So she did that in Chicago. She also traveled internationally. She was very passionate about lynching, and she was very vocal in confronting white women about how they were ignoring the plight of Black women and their rights and why they couldn't be involved in the suffrage movement. So, again, just a really incredible advocate for that agenda. And this is just, yeah, this is a very, I feel, pretty famous photo that is out there that shows child labor. You look at these young kids who were, I think these kids, this is a mining photo, the conditions that they were exposed to. And it's just really heartbreaking, seeing that, knowing they worked like 6 days a week, 12-hour days, they were paid literally nothing, right? And that's why the factories and the mines, and that's why they loved hiring children, right? Because they could pay them nothing. They could control them, manipulate them. The kids would usually listen to them without making a big fuss. So they loved having children. Um, and so that picture is just a really stark reminder of what child labor was really starting to emerge as during that time. And of course, there were, the movement to try to abolish child slavery, and a lot of protests and things were happening to try and persuade the public, right? The progressives were saying this is wrong, we shouldn't do this, trying to persuade public opinion that this needs to be outlawed, this needs to be regulated. And then, of course, looking at these these boarding schools again for um, indigenous children, just horrifying, um, to look at these photos. I think this one is a school in Montana, and this photo you can really see here sort of what they were forcing people to do, to really leave behind their culture, leave behind everything that made them who they were, and become, more of the Protestant white man's culture. Um, so now we are at Jane Addams and the Hull House. So Jane Addams, as you may know, she is really looked at as one of the founders of the social work practice. Her early life was one of privilege and education, like a lot of leaders in the settlement house movement. She was the daughter of a very affluent, person. I think he was like a trader or a merchant, some sort of high regarded position. She went to the seminary. She was just an incredible student there. She went to England with Ellen Gates Starr, who was another leader in the settlement house movement. And she was able to visit this London settlement house and really understand what they were doing in London to help specifically immigrants with transitioning to life in America and getting the support that they needed. So she rented this mansion basically in Chicago, in a pretty impoverished immigrant neighborhood, and opened the Hall House. It was named like right before 1900, and it really served as a place to welcome immigrant communities, to provide them support. Um, and Jane Addams herself, she worked in numerous labor union organizations. She was an advocate for tenement housing, factory laws, child labor laws. She was an advocate for adult education, cultural exchange groups, and really starting to collect neighborhood demographic information. She thought that that was something that they should be doing at that time. She was the leader of many clubs and was just very engaged in what was happening, not only in her neighborhood, but also really nationally in terms of social welfare during that time. So they opened the Hull House, and at first it was mainly Italian, Irish, German, Greek, Russian, and Jewish immigrants, right? Primarily from Poland and Russia. And then, they opened up a kindergarten, daycare facilities. They tried to help people find work. They had an art gallery. They had a library. They had English classes, citizenship classes, theater, music, art classes, cooking classes, sewing. You could learn other technical skills. And then they had this American government class. So it was kind of a place where you could celebrate your own culture, but also learn about American culture and things that you needed to know to be quote unquote successful in assimilating to this new life. Um, so that is her story. So, the charity organization movement, charity organization societies, they really emerged to address urban poverty, right? And this is really another origin of the social work profession. Um, in this time there were almshouses, there was still assistance that was being given by the government. Um, but this movement was really looking at sort of operated under these principles that the poor were poor because of their own moral deficiencies, right? Wasn't really looking at the fact that they couldn't find jobs, they were sick, they couldn't work, they were disabled, didn't look at that. It was essentially that their moral character was flawed. And number two, really thinking that if they address this moral deficiency, that these individuals could be fixed, right? That was sort of what they were operating under, the assumption. um, and the third thing that was really important to them was that they needed to cooperate with other charity organizations to to influence positive change. So the first charity organization societies, they were established in, before 1900, um, but they really took hold in this progressive period, 1900, 1930s time period. And so essentially what it was is it was like these friendly visitors, they called them, that were usually middle upper class women, volunteers, predominantly Protestant women, who did this friendly visiting in homes of poor people to establish sort of a helping relationship and talk to the family about what their needs were and try to assist them in any needs that they might have. Leaders of these charity organization societies were typically middle upper class men, some from the clergy as well. They usually didn't give money directly to the poor. They usually advocated for, you know, to try and not do that as much as they could. And they had people within the organization that were like moral oversight, and they they had a lot of really interesting views on the poor and really the best ways in terms of serving that group of people. um so yes, I think there were definitely some positive things in the charity organization society, some positive takeaways that we can take from that. And also, again, looking at the fact that they really had this very deficit focused view of treating people. They sort of assumed this expert role in terms of engaging communities. Um, and then finally, Mary Richmond, during this time, she wrote Social Diagnosis, and kind of the mother of modern casework. So this was, a pretty big thing to have happen. Really, um, was Mary saying that we needed to approach, this helping profession in a systematic way. We needed to collect data. We needed to have a methodology of diagnosis. And we need to start looking at people in terms of not just this isolated person, but we need to look at them in terms of their environment, right? This whole person and environment way of approaching communities, which we know led way to a lot of really important theories that we still use in the social work practice, right? So she's like systems theory, which is really the basis of a lot of what we hold to be important in engaging clients and communities. So she was sort of looking at what are the causes of poverty? What are what are we seeing? We're seeing people who are socially isolated. We're seeing, how is this person in interaction with his or her environment? Um, so that was definitely a really important sort of segue into more of a professionalized social work, uh, social work emphasis and social work education. And so this is the basketball team at the Hull House, kind of a washed out photo. You can't see the woman at the bottom is holding a basketball, but that is the team, the basketball team there. That is a photo of people eating at the Hull House together, enjoying community, eating together, enjoying, traditional foods, also making newer foods. This is the main living area, kind of the living room area of the Hull House. The children's playground that they eventually added on to there. So this is what the Hull House looks like now. It's a museum. It's in Chicago. So if you ever go there, it's on my bucket list. I would definitely love to do that someday. This is a picture of what it used to look like during that progressive time period here. And so this is the neighborhood house. And I talked a little bit about the neighborhood house earlier. It was the first photo here on this PowerPoint. And I want to tell you a little bit about the history here. I shared that it was really founded by this group of Jewish women from Mount Zion, who wanted to start sewing classes, wanted to kind of have a place for people to honor their culture and traditions, and also start learning about what they would need to be successful in their new lives. And so they had, similar, very similar to the Hull House model, right? They had English language classes, American citizenship classes, um, education, daycare, a baby clinic, and a lot of different programs for adults. And so it was really the place to be during this time period, right? In the West Side Flats, it was. Um, there were a lot of things going on in that community, difficulties with housing, overcrowding of housing, unemployment, discrimination, just a lot happening. So it was just a really positive place that people could come and join together in community. And it was really a model for a lot of the other settlement houses that opened up here in the Twin Cities. Um, and so this was the original settlement house, the original neighborhood house, which I think I mentioned was destroyed when the St. Paul Port Authority destroyed a large area right by the river because they said it wasn't safe due to flooding, but then put up a flood wall. So um, that is what happened. And the neighborhood house is still here. There, I've got a photo of it. Just a beautiful, incredible building. It is a very special place to me. That is where I did my very first, or no, second social work internship. I did it during the summer just because I wanted more experience. I didn't do it through my school. I just wanted to do it just because I really wanted that experience to work with an immigrant refugee program. And then I volunteered for years after that in their food shelf, interpreting, helping Spanish speaking families access emergency food from the food shelf. So just have so many incredible memories of this place and this community. And it's just a very, very dear place um, that will always be in my heart. So if you're ever on the west side, definitely go visit, go take a look. It's an incredible building. El Burrito Mercado is right there too, so you can have an incredible lunch while you're at it. And this is another photo from the neighborhood house. Again, later time period as you can see, but just love this photo, right? Of the girls learning how to sew, and it's really fun looking through those archive photos. And so this is a video about Jane Addams, about her life and about the Hull House. So we can take a quick pause and watch that right now.
Many low-income families who had come to Chicago. Born in Cedarville, Illinois, Jane Addams was raised in a family with a high social status. Her father was a prosperous miller and a local political leader. He served 16 years as a state senator, fought as an officer in the Civil War, and was a friend to Abraham Lincoln. At an early age, Jane Addams was diagnosed with congenital spinal defect and was very ill throughout her entire life. But her illness didn't stop her from graduating from the Rockford Female Seminary in 1881 with a bachelor's degree. At the age of 27, Addams took a tour of Europe with her friend Ellen Starr, where they visited a settlement house known as Toneby Hall in London's East End. That visit helped finalize the idea of opening a similar house in an underprivileged area of Chicago, where the focus of Jane Addams's work was located. At that time, Chicago was home to many low-income families who had come to Chicago for a better life. Immigrants and African Americans inhabited most of Chicago in slums with barely enough money to feed their families. Some found it hard to find jobs due to racism, while others because of language barriers. Children didn't go to school, so those who could speak English were forced to support their families, working as shoeshine boys or newsboys. Many fathers who could work, immigrant or not, earned low incomes, died early, or simply deserted their families, forcing children to once again pick up the slack. With diseases like smallpox and TB on the rise, doctors' visits became essential to survival, but many families were too poor to afford to see one. Factory workers worked in poor conditions. Dehumanized, impersonal factories led to many uprisings as workers struggled for shorter hours, higher wages, and better safety standards. Cuts in wages resulted in revolts and riots. Amidst this struggling society, Addams and Starr founded the Hull House in 1889. The purpose was to provide a center for higher civic and social life, to institute and maintain educational and philanthropic enterprises, and to investigate and improve the conditions in the industrial districts of Chicago. Social settlements like Hull House and Toneby Hall were created in response to problems created by urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. Settlement houses attracted educated, native-born, middle-class and upper-class men and women, known as residents, to live or settle in poor urban neighborhoods to help the area's poor and homeless. Hull House set the foundation for social work in America. It was located in a populated urban neighborhood in Chicago. It was host to many programs, including kindergarten classes, daycare, club meetings, and night school. They added an art gallery, a public kitchen, a coffee house, a gym, a pool, a book bindery, a music school, an employment bureau, and a labor museum. It also offered a meeting place for trade unions and cultural events in the surrounding neighborhoods. The residents of Hull House made speeches about the needs of the neighborhood, raised money, took care of children, and nursed the sick. After the second year of operation, Hull House was host to over 2,000 people every week. Addams wrote many articles and books devoted to the ideals she fought for, but also found herself in the eye of the media many times. She was criticized because she fought for equality and was often accused of being a socialist, an anarchist, and a communist. Her theories on cultural feminism were bashed in the media, but it didn't stop her willingness to fight for what she believed was right and just. She continued to rally for the rights of women as well as for peace. She founded many organizations in peace efforts and held office in them until her death. After her death in 1935, Hull House continued to serve Chicago residents through the Depression of the 1930s and World War II, and the organization she founded and supported made great strides in equality. While Hull House is one of Jane Addams's most known achievements, it was certainly not the last. Throughout her adult life, Addams founded and supported many social programs, such as supporting the founding of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founding the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and helping found the Chicago Federation of Settlements. She and other lobbyists worked for legislation to protect immigrants from exploitation, limit working hours for women, mandate schooling for children, recognize labor unions, and provide industrial safety. Addams worked as a mediator in the Chicago garment workers' strike and served as vice president of the National Women's Trade Union League. She became the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. Jane Addams's contributions to society changed people's views on equality and had great impacts on many lives. She created the foundation for social work in America, giving many opportunities to low-income families and individuals. Through her work and the work of others, society has been changed, offering a better world for future generations.
In terms of social movements in the early 20th century, we talked about labor groups. Um, we talked about, in these movements, these really important societal commitments to enhance women's rights, to put an end to child labor, um, and looking at really what was going on politically. So this photo, it's a photo of the Knights of Labor. It was the first national industrial union in the United States. It was founded in Philadelphia, um, by some garment workers. And, at this time period, there was a lot going on politically, right? It was sort of, again, this feeling of wanting to stop corruption, right? Progressives really were seeing this growing wealth gap between the rich and the poor. And and this feeling of, why are only, a handful of the wealthiest people in the country, why are they owning so much of the national income, right? So there were just a lot of people saying, like, hey, I am literally working like 60 hours a week, and I should be getting more money than what I'm being paid, and I should be having more rights, right? So that was definitely a feeling that was growing, which I think was in part, a big catalyst for the Socialist Party to be flourishing during this time. It was really created during, early 1900s, right? And it was really in response to these feelings that, immigrants were having, and even native born people and their families who were struggling, farmers, you know, the, just a really diverse group of people that flocked to this, intellectual folks, um, reformers, feminists. So the party platform really included reform. It included sort of this long goal of kind of eradicating this capitalism that they were seeing, that a lot of the working folks identified with their ability not to have what they felt was fair to them. um, so that was definitely interesting. We saw some legislation. We saw the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed shortly before 1900. It helped really to break up monopolies that were forming and prevent monopolies from happening in the future, looking at the steel industries, the railroad industries, and that was definitely happening. We also see federal regulations starting for meat packing, for drugs, railroad industry. And then we start seeing some legislation coming in for improved working conditions. Um, and then we talked a lot about the women's suffrage movement earlier. Uh, we did not talk about the temperance movement. So that was really sort of religiously based in a lot of ways. And a lot of people felt that, men were drinking a lot and then were not really available to their families, available to work. And and many people viewed this alcoholism as just a really horrible thing that needed to be dealt with. And so this temperance movement really began cautioning drinking, encouraging people not to drink. And we know that led to the efforts that eventually led to prohibition. So pretty successful movement on their part. So we will watch a movie here, um, that is about one of the biggest disasters here, that really prompted a lot of rights for workers, for garment workers specifically. And we'll take a pause here and watch that movie.
On April 5th, 1911, 400,000 people lined the rain-drenched sidewalks of New York as an empty horse-drawn hearse crept from the dank, narrow streets of the Lower East Side toward the skyscrapers towering over Madison Square. New Yorkers from all walks of life had come to pay tribute to the unidentified victims of the Triangle Fire, the deadliest workplace accident in the city's history. A few weeks earlier, the workers had been forgotten cogs in America's immense industrial machine. Now, 1 in 10 New Yorkers were there to claim them as their own.
Public conscience thought they had failed these young women. They had somehow not protected them.
There was a recognition, wait, these girls can't die in vain. That was said over and over and over again, as if the city had somehow turned its back on them.
If there weren't massive funerals, it would have been very easy for the city and the city officials to say, well, this is it's sort of a natural disaster, it's a terrible thing, but there's nothing anyone can do about it.
If you ask the average American, is it okay for workers to work in a shop where the conditions are so dangerous that it could cost them their lives and not have government intervene? Most people would say no. There's a line. The Triangle Fire drew that line. It burned that line, really, into the nation's conscience.
Every morning, 6 days a week, more than 100,000 people poured out onto the streets of the Lower East Side, headed toward another day's work in the city's garment factories. Many were young women in their teens. Some were girls as young as 10. They were immigrants, Italians who had fled natural disaster, Jews who had escaped persecution in Russia, Ukraine, Poland. Their families had chosen America for its promise of a better future. But even the youngest daughters had come to understand that their precarious hold on the American dream depended on their willingness to work.
Father had to take me to the shop and not be late for his own work. I was eager to begin life on my own responsibility, but was also afraid. "Don't look so frightened," he said.
These young girls weren't just earning money for their own clothes or to, go out to a dance hall or to Coney Island. They were earning money to support the family.
Economic security was the American dream for many of them. Making enough money to be able to put food on the table, not worry about making rent for the week.
As the throng disappeared into sweatshops and tenement apartments, several hundred workers veered off toward the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in the heart of Greenwich Village. At the base of the Ash Building, men and women stepped into wooden freight elevators to ascend to the Triangle Factory on the 8th and 9th floors. Workers like Michaela Marciano, who managed to send a few dollars to her family in Italy every month. Or Julia Rosen, whose 17-year-old son worked alongside her to help support 3 younger children. Or Catherine Maltese, whose 13-year-old daughter wasn't too young to join her on the factory floor.
Getting a job in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a pretty desired position because they were working in a much more modern factory environment. High ceilings, big windows, compared to the coal stove heated, dusty, hugely crowded sweatshop rooms. Triangle was a plum.
But even at the Triangle, sewing machine operators faced a 14-hour workday for $2 a day at most. And that was before bosses docked their pay for the needles, the thread, the electricity they used.
Sometimes you work at a big machine, and it's not working right. One of the needles skips, and you get blamed for mistakes. The same machines, the same surrounding. Shirtwaists, and more shirtwaists.
On the 10th floor, the Triangle owners could feel their vast machine shuddering below. Max Blank and Isaac Harris had made Triangle a $1 million a year behemoth, mass-producing the garment every modern woman must have, the shirtwaist. Harris and Blank were known as the Shirtwaist Kings, but their empire, as they saw it, was under constant siege. After 20 years, the shirtwaist was getting stale. Fashion editors began to showcase colorful dresses for the modern woman and turned up their noses at the bourgeois waist. No matter how much silk embroidery Harris added to their designs, the Triangle sales charts sloped down. Material and shipping costs seemed always to be rising. Profit margins matched this year's fashion, teasingly sheer.
For Max and Isaac, there was this constant awareness that they were, as successful and as rich as they were one bad season away from being broke. The competition was enormously fierce. 500 blouse makers on the island of Manhattan alone.
While they're getting the orders from the department stores, there's some small shop half a mile away that's willing to beat them by half. So it's all about continuous production to get as much cloth turned into a product as possible at the lowest possible price.
That summer, there was a growing new threat. All over the city, garment workers were agitating for shorter hours, better pay, safer shops, unions. Harris and Blank saw it in the papers every day and on the streets below. Workers were walking off the job by the tens, scores, hundreds. The partners even suspected talk of union on their own shop floor.
Unionization was the single largest fear for most of these employers. They were terrified that unions would come in because that would diminish their authority over the workplace.
The right to control their own factory was an article of faith for Harris and Blank, as for hundreds of business owners just like them.
In nearly every major category for the past several decades, Texas has always been ranked as only being America's second largest state. When counting by amount of land, Texas has always remained second, sitting in Alaska's gigantic shadow ever since they were admitted as a state back in 1959. There's even a common joke in Alaska that Alaska could be divided in half, and then Texas would get to only be the third largest American state. Then, when counting by amount of people, Texas has also long sat in the shadow of California. The most recent US-wide census in 2020 revealed that at that time, California had around 10 million more people than Texas. And correspondingly, when counting the states by the size of their economies, Texas has once again long sat in second place to California's larger first. But while the gap in size of land between Texas and Alaska can never be filled, the gap in size of people and economy between Texas and California has recently been narrowing rapidly. Because for the past 20 plus years, Texas has been growing much more quickly than California has been, and it's been a long time coming. For decades now, Texas has been steadily making its way climbing up the ranks of America's most populous states. Way back in 1960, Texas was only ranked 6th out of America's 50 states by population, behind Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, and New York. You see, from the time of the third ever American census taken in 1810 to a century and a half later in 1960, New York constantly remained as America's longest-lasting, most populous, and most influential state. But the pace of American settlers moving to the west and the south to states like California, Texas, and Florida were rapidly picking up pace by the mid-20th century. By the time when the 1970 US Census rolled around, a startling realization was made. For the first time since the 1810 census taken 160 years previously, another state had finally surpassed New York to become America's newest, most populous state, California. It was the very beginning of California's demographic dominance over all the other American states. And for the half a century ever since then, California has continually remained in the top position. By 1990, roughly 12% of all Americans were Californians, a proportion that
So, in closing, the era of progress and reform really showcases that playing fields for society were not fair, were not equitable, right? We see stigma of groups relying on assistance. We see policy legislation informed from societal attitudes on how to help the poor. We see there is really a cumulative advantage and a cumulative disadvantage for groups of people, right? So when we talk about generational wealth versus generational oppression, um, if you haven't seen the James J. Hill house to get a sense of how the rich were living during this time, definitely go check it out. And as an example, you look at James J. Hill. James J. Hill owned the community that is now North Oaks, right? One of the most affluent communities in the Twin Cities area, probably in the state of Minnesota. And again, was owned by then his family. So you see how that generational wealth really starts to accumulate. And really our history shows the importance of meaningful and decisive impact through policy driven practices, really in all forms of practice, one-on-one, micro, groups, meso, and larger settings, macro realms. And just have some reflection questions that we can reflect on, that I want you to think about in terms of this time period here. And in closing, this is a video that I made many, many years ago. I was an undergrad at this time, and it was a video that I made with one of my mentors, Gilbert DeLao, who was community liaison at the neighborhood house, grew up receiving services from the neighborhood house, just an incredible leader here in the St. Paul community. And it was really my honor to get to know him. And, you'll see in this video, he is just, wow, he is quite a force. And he is the west side of St. Paul. He is, he exemplifies the people and their struggles and really what they have done to advocate for themselves and for their community, and just was such an honor to know him. So I will leave you with West Side Story 2, and thank you so much again for joining me as we talked about this very important period here in social welfare history. And happy Social Work Month.
Hola, me llamo Jessica. Yo soy una estudiante de la Universidad de Eau Claire. Estoy estudiando para ser una trabajadora social y también quiero trabajar con hispanohablantes. Thanks for joining me. As I just said in Spanish, my name is Jessica, and I'm a student at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. I'm studying to become a social worker, and I want to work with the Hispanic population. This program is for students, social workers, teachers, counselors, or anyone engaged with the Mexican American community, or for anyone who simply wants to learn about their culture. 3 professionals in the field will be sharing strategies on how to work with an interpreter, tips for encouraging good client relations, how to develop cross-cultural skills, and much more. We'll also be taking a closer look at a local Mexican American community and what agencies and practitioners are doing to be more culturally competent. Last summer, I did an internship at the Neighborhood House, which is located on the west side of St. Paul at the Paul and Sheila Wellstone Center for Community Building. I was constantly learning what it means to be culturally competent and how important this is to social workers and members of all helping professions. This program takes an ethnographic approach, which involves describing a cultural group in terms of their own environment. I'm focusing on the West Side because not a lot of people know that such a large Mexican American population lives here. I also want to show appreciation to the community that has given me so much and to tell their wonderful stories. Right now I'm standing on the Robert Street Bridge, which is a major gateway into the West Side. In front of me is downtown St. Paul, and behind me is the West Side community. The West Side actually gets its name because it's on the west bank of the Mississippi River, even though it's a little south of the city. For a social worker, it's important to know the history of the community in which he or she is working. In order to do this, we're going to use the West Side as an example. And who better to talk to than longtime resident and recently retired community liaison at the Neighborhood House, Gilbert De La O. So let's go learn about the Mexican American community on the West Side and its amazing history. Vámonos.
My family situation coming to Minnesota probably is similar to tens of thousands of Mexican Americans that came to Minnesota starting in the 20s and until this day too. In the early 1920s, the Minnesota Sugar Company, which is now called Crystal Sugar, they couldn't find enough Minnesotans to work in the sugar beet industry, in the fields, before the process, but in the fields. So what they did is that they went down to the Southwest and Mexico and started recruiting folks to come up to Minnesota to work. So that's how my family started coming. My family started coming to Minnesota in the mid-30s, and all kinds of us started coming, and it was all the same kind of structure. We would leave wherever state, we were in Texas, our home base was Bridgeport, Texas. So we would leave Texas by April and come up here and work the fields, and then by October, we were back in our base camp back in Texas. That same story, you know, my uncles, my grandfathers, my friends, my parents, my friends' family, they all had that similar situation. Going back there, you can come every year. But don't live by us. Our base camp where we worked in Minnesota, we worked in New Ulm, Sleepy Eye, Gaylord, and Winthrop. That's where we worked. So when we were asked to stay, it was don't stay in those communities, you know, go somewhere else. It's that same thing that goes on today. I mean, we're good enough to work in people's communities, but we're not good enough to live in them, you know. Pretty soon they started telling us, go back to Mexico, you're taking our jobs. The jobs up here in Minnesota are only for white people. My dad used to tell me seeing signs that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed. So that same kind of atmosphere that's prevalent right now happened back then. And the thing that's interesting, too, is that over 300 people, like in the mid-30s, were deported from here, from the West Side, from the St. Paul airport. And just like today, they found out that after they went through this 2-week process, they found that I think there was like 225, 230 of them were citizens of the United States. They were Mexican American. But they, you know, during that Depression time, they were rounding up folks. If you spoke Spanish, if you looked Mexican, that means you're here illegal, and then they shipped them back. So that same story, as you hear, it goes on today. Back in the 1920s, there was a fellow by the name of Luis Garzon who came up with the Mexican Symphony Orchestra to play over in Minneapolis. After 2 weeks, they went back to Mexico, except him. They said he got sick. Some say he drank our water. I don't know if that's true or not, but he got sick, and so he stayed in Minnesota. And what he did then, he opened up a little general store here on the West Side. So consequently, when folks went to, the migrant workers that came, when they had the Sunday off, they'd come to the West Side, to talk to Garcon because he had all the scuttlebutt, he had all the information. So consequently, eventually, we just started living down here on the west side. It's like it was like the stopping place. You come here and you stop and you start planting roots. Some of the roots stay on the west side, and other ones, you go out somewhere else, But you originally start here. There was a book written called West Side Story. Not the play West Side Story, but by a fellow who grew up in neighborhood house. His name is Bill Hoffman, and in his book, he said that when he was growing up, he thought that maybe that the Statue of Liberty should have been put over on the west side, because if you looked at all the diversity that came over in Ellis Island, it was the same thing here on the west side. So it would have been appropriate to put Our Lady here too. Port Authority told our parents that this was going to be urban renewal stuff happened in our community, and really it was actually urban removal. Where we're sitting at today, this is West Side Story 2. This is the second story of West Side. The original West Side was about a mile from here, down about half a mile from here. That's where the original neighborhood house was. That's where this multicultural community was. That's where I was raised. One of the things that happened in that community was that in the 50s, there was some major flooding. The river overflowed, and we lived in a sixplex, and the river water went all the way up to our porches. I mean, so we had to evacuate. So during those two major floods that happened in the 50s, we evacuated, and when the waters receded, we went back in and we cleaned up our houses and all that. Neighborhood House and the Red Cross were really instrumental on really helping the families there back then. So anyway, the Port Authority got this idea that the area that we lived in, it was called West Side Flats. They felt that was because of all the flooding. It's a dangerous place to live. Blah 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 blah. We got to get you folks out of there to a better place. So that's what they did. But what happened is that the Port Authority came in there and said, "This is what we're going to pay you for your property. Take it or leave it." Because otherwise, if you don't take it, we'll just do eminent domain. So a lot of folks, including my folks, they really got hoodwinked for what they got for their property. So the Port Authority went in there, started in the late 50s, early 60s, and they demolished everything. Our houses, our churches, our grocery stores, our neighborhood house, just wiped it off all on the map. And I know, later on, I'm sure you know about the Trail of Tears that happened to the Cherokee Indians, and they were moved west of the Mississippi. Even though our move wasn't as drastic, but I think our spirit was just broken, just like those Indian spirits were broken when they had to move. Even to this day, people still are really upset about what happened to us back then. And the biggest insult for us. And again, I think this is what really gets that generation of my father's generation, the folks that are in their 70s and 80s and 90s. What riled them the most was after they kicked us out, after they demolished everything, they put up a flood wall so the place doesn't get flooded anymore. And it was like, why didn't you do that right away? So they moved us out. So we had to move out. So now where are we going to go? Where this community is, where we are today. This community back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was primarily white folks living in this community. So when this community heard that we're going to be moving, they got frantic. So they started a petition that's saying, hey, we can't let these Mexicans move up here. They went to the city, all this stuff is documented. They went to the St. Paul City Council and said, you can't let all those Mexicans, all those minorities from the West Side Flats move up here because they're gonna ghettoize our community. They're gonna make troublemakers of their children. So they're all paranoid. And but unfortunately, whatever it was, we still came. We moved up here, and what's interesting then is that a lot of these folks that lived here moved to another part of the West Side, further up the hill. That area up there started calling themselves the Upper West Side, and us that live around here are called the Lower West Side, man. And upper and lower, that's really saying something. This was during the 60s. It was a great time happening during the 60s. A lot of stuff going on. A lot of stuff, man. You know, all kinds of different movements going on. The Chicano movement, the Black Panther movement, the women, the hippies. Everything was happening. Everything was happening. And so we were doing our own little thing here on the west side, too. I happened to have a group. We called ourselves the Brown Berets. People really saw us as a kind of a threat, revolutionaries, and I think, well, you know, the way we were dressed with the berets and all that stuff gave some indication of that. The Chicano movement started in the late '60s. You know, we were saying, we were demanding, we were asking, we were saying all this stuff, which kind of contradicted with my father's generation. My father's first generation that came here to Minnesota. Again, honest day's work for honest day's pay, be respectful, all those kinds of things, believe in authority, don't question authority. So when we started the movement, started questioning authority, I mean, that all those folks were saying, oh, wait a minute, what are you doing, man? You know, you can't be doing this stuff, you know. You can't be questioning the police. You know, when we were asking the hospitals, you know, where's the translators? Not we don't have translators for some of our folks, man, you know. That went to the waste, you know, we're questioning. And but it was interesting, though. It was interesting that in 1970, the packing houses, Swift and Armours, which became a multi-billion-dollar meat packing industry on the backs of a lot of West Siders and Mexican Americans that worked there, they closed their doors. They closed their doors. And for my father's generation, it was like the bubble burst. When they worked at Swift's and Armours, there was better pay than working out in the fields. The working conditions were better than working out in the fields, but yet there was still some discrimination and racism going on out there. But again, as long as they had a job, the Swifts, you know, with their credit union, you know, people were able to get a loan to get their first car, get their house. So, you know, this was the place. And then when they closed the shop, I remember being here on the west side, being at the Cozy Bar. It was filled with men that got laid off. It was a sad day on the west side to see grown men cry and think, it was upsetting. So during this time, I was able to talk to my dad and his friends about the Chicano movement. You know, asking my dad and his friends, you know, like, you know, I know you guys are hard workers. How many Mexican Americans were supervisors at Swift? You know, none. You know, how many union representatives were Mexican American? None. You know, so after a while they started hearing, you know, getting a little bit of it. Where my father, bless his heart, man, it was probably, I think in '71, he asked me he wanted one of my brown beret coats to wear, man. He's gonna be a brown beret, man. So that was real cool. He finally got it. If you can't talk about the West Side without mentioning the Our Lady of Guadalupe Church or the neighborhood house. There's no way, because both of them have been icons in our community. You know, Neighborhood House was founded in 1897 by some Jewish women, and they were there to prepare, getting ready for all the folks that were coming in from Northern Europe. So now it's like it's coming all over again. You know, now we got Europeans starting to come over again. There's been an explosion. Especially in the last 10 to 15 years, of all the Hispanic cultures come to our community. I mean, they come from Central America, they come from Mexico, South America. They're coming from all over the place, you know. And then probably within the last 5 years now we're getting folks coming in from other continents. We're getting folks coming from Africa, East Africa, West Africa. And there's that 3 programs that they started back in 1897 for those newly arrivals was learn English, citizenship, and a place to honor and celebrate traditions and culture. Well, you turn the clock forward to 2007, 3 of the 30-some programs that we do at Neighborhood House are English classes, citizenship, and a place to honor and traditions and stuff. My granddaughter enrolling in childcare in the early 90s, that made 4 generations of my family that had used Neighborhood House services. And again, my story is similar to lots of folks that have been here, used the Neighborhood House. And it was interesting for me as an employee to see some of the young people that I worked with over the years, and now seeing their children coming to the Neighborhood House, into our youth programs and doing things like that. So, yeah, it's really cool. And I think in this 1997, when we celebrated our centennial, we had a picnic, a picnic dinner, and there was folks that were with Neighborhood House in the 30s and the 40s that came and just talked heartfelt thoughts of Neighborhood House, what it meant to them when they were growing up, and I could certainly relate to them because it meant the same thing to me.